Well, thank you all very much. Thanks, Jayati, for the invitation. Thanks, PERI and UMass for inviting me. And I'm gonna go a little fast because we have a lot to cover in little time. So I'll begin. Um, Before I get into the some of the issues that I wanted to discuss, I just wanted to lay out some alerts, some flags around the issues that we've been talking about these past 2 days around debt and climate financing. One, I think, Debtors Club, I've been counting the times they've been saying, I've heard it now over 36 times. I haven't been in all the presentations, but I think it's definitely an issue. I think Karina mentioned not only, the financial coordination, but just the exchanging of experiences would be extremely useful. Second, and I think we've had this taboo, as if a default is the end of the world. And I think default is a legitimate option that should be on the table and should be an element of discussion, especially during this conference. I think right now we're in a point in time where we can coordinate default with several countries. And I think we have now to get into the operationalization of that issue as well. Also, we have to set up a club together against vulture-friendly legal frameworks. The initiative that's being discussed in New York State is very important, but the discussion should be broadened to other jurisdictions, including Luxembourg, London, etc. I think, deserve to have the odious and illegitimate debt discussion on the table as well, and how that relates to the rational expectations around the pricing of the secondary bond markets. And I think that's a really key issue when discussing everything about debt restructure, especially because given Ecuador's experience when we audited the debt, we found that some of the main bondholders behind the several veils of custodians, central securities depositories, and big banks and offshore firms, we actually had, the same former Minister of Finances that were bondholders, and that they were actually negotiating the debt with themselves. So we have to expand the discussion of beneficiary owner into bonds as well. And also, I think something that hasn't been yet discussed is the fact that we haven't really gone into deep analysis of credit default swaps, how those auctions work, who are the protagonists, who are the main players there, and if there is a role for states in that respect, specifically if we now consider default a legitimate option. And one final flag is that, there's this growing new type of debt, which is debt derived from arbitration awards, investor state dispute settlement awards, specifically now that they're being third-party financed by the same vulture funds that have been protagonists of the holdouts, so-called holdouts in debt restructuring processes. So now I want to talk about SDRs. I think you're all very familiar with this distribution, that in the last allocation of SDRs in 2021, most of it went to the rich countries, a part went to the low-income countries. And so the immediate response to this is, oh, this is bad, we should fix this bad distribution. And I'm going to try to be a bit controversial about this. First, I think that the term that has been used to try to fix this, unequal situation, which is SDR rechanneling, is just a euphemism for more debt, as has been discussed in the past couple of days. I think that it is inadequate to call it rechanneling. We should just call it lending or debt. I think we don't need to call it a euphemism, and that's a very important starting point. Second, why I say and claim this is dead, because it makes no sense from the creditor side. First, SDRs are on the central bank's balance sheets, and they have very strict restrictions as to how they can use them. They're not just a budget item. Second, the central banks, because of some accounting methodology issues that I will discuss shortly, have to face an asset liability mismatch. Third, SDR debt means that rich countries that are going to lend these will have a drop in their liquid external assets, while if they lend in their local currencies, they don't have that drop. Fourth, the yield of those debts has to be above the SDR rate as defined by the IMF. And of course, by lending with local currency, they can get, lending can be at a much lower or concessional rate. And then finally, all the pledges that several campaigners have been proud about, that Macron, even showcased in a global concert, they have not effectively materialized. The RST has only dispersed a billion SDRs, or $1.3 billion, after 2.5 years of claiming that rechanneling was going to be a solution for this. And this is just more debt with more conditionality, just basically standard IMF programs that are not convenient. The PRGT, if you say, oh, that's going to be a solution for rechanneling, well, its total loan portfolio is $18 billion, which is basically nothing for these rich countries. So we shouldn't really take this seriously on a macro global perspective, not of course in terms how it may be of impact to individual countries. Now, what we need instead of all this rechanneling charlatanery is a new issuance of SDRs. This is what actually works. This is what has worked. It is verifiable, and we have the data. Second, it's very important to mention that while traditionally the SDRs have been considered an external asset, a reserve asset, something that can only be used by the central banks only for balance of payments purposes, well, something happened 2 years ago when the IMF published this nice infographic that said, hey, why don't we use the SDRs to buy vaccines? Last time I heard, it's not the central banks buying the vaccines, it's the ministries of health. So we are now considering the SDRs a fiscal asset. The use of SDRs for fiscal purposes, such as the vaccines, and for climate investment is just one tiny step away. And I think now we are in that venture. We are now in that discussion. We should consider now that it has been legitimized to use SDR for fiscal purposes, including for climate-related investment purposes. Now, if we can use it for fiscal purposes, it means we can use it for debt relief as well. And at CPER, we've been pushing this line for a while, that SDRs are good because they improve the external position, so they reduce the need for foreign exchange debt. They also improve the fiscal position, as I have just showed, thus reducing the need for public debt. There are some legal and accounting arrangements for the fiscal use of SDRs in developing countries, which is a good plus. That we have discussed thoroughly over the last few years. They can also be used to directly settle obligations with the IMF. So it is not mandatory to convert them to so-called hard currency every time. You can actually use the SDRs directly to pay old IMF debts. Therefore, since you didn't have them in the past and now you have them, and you pay debts with that, you are incurring in a form of debt relief. And as we all know, if used, the principal need not be paid back to the SDR department at the IMF. Even when I get some pushback from IMF people, even at an exaggerated 5% SDR rate that countries do have to pay for using the SDRs and incurring in a net negative position of SDRs, this would mean that the principal would attrition only after 20 years of so-called debt service of a so-called perpetual loan interest payments for the use of the SDRs. And I bet that within those 20 years, we'll have a new issuance, hopefully. So this is very important to take into account. Now, I wanted to diverge just a little bit as a parenthesis on an accounting controversy that I think that this audience should know about regarding SDRs. And it is the fact that in the previous methodology approved by the International Monetary Fund, they used to consider the SDR allocation equity of the central banks, right? So the IMF issued the SDRs and the central banks would have an increase in equity. Now that was very important because that means that all of a sudden they had more resources, more net wealth to use. In the sixth version of the balance of payments manual, now they say that it's not equity, it's an infinite liability. Now we know that economically they're equivalent, but accounting and legally they're very different. And that creates problems both for developing and rich countries in terms of how they can use the SDRs. We also have an accounting problem within the IMF. In the debt statistics methodology, they say we should count the SDRs as debt, even if you haven't used them. While the IMF DSA, the debt sustainability analysis, says, no, you really don't have to pay them back, so we exclude them from the debt sustainability analysis. But they show up in the debt to GDP ratios, but they don't show up in the cash flow analyses, right? So there's a controversy there as well. The DSA says, well, the only part that should be counted as debt is the net interest, the part that has to be actually paid for using the SDRs. And I agree that that's more reasonable, but let's not forget that component, the net interest for using the SDRs, if you have a net negative position of SDRs, would, in the present value, would be zero or even negative, due to the fact that the discount rate used to calculate how much you have to pay in the future in the present value is higher than the SDR rate itself. So it's the best of all worlds. Here's an important screenshot from a document published by the IMF when they changed the methodology from BPM-5 to BPM-6. And it's fun because they are very explicit about this. They say it used to be considered equity. It used to be, basically net wealth that countries would have. And now it's considered debt. And that important change has many, many implications, as I will discuss. So here is a quick example. This is the left side, you have the old methodology, and the right side, you have the new methodology. With the old methodology, a rich country, for example, that wanted to donate 10 SDRs received after the allocation would have, a small reduction in their equity, but it would still be larger than before the issuance. So you could have a net increase in equity even after donations. In the case of BPM-6, because you're now required to register the SDR allocation as liabilities, now if you donate the SDRs, you're going to have a drop in equity below that which you had before the issuance. So of course, no central banker and no accountant, nobody that wants to be prudential about their finances is going to approve a donation of SDRs, because now they're going to have a drop in equity instead of a lesser increase. Now, this is important. Now, going to something related but different. We have been talking about, creditor double AAA rating for multilateral development banks and how they can turn, questionable things into gold. Just because they intermediate international funds to countries, and they have the senior creditor status, and it will be very difficult to convince MDBs to enter into a debt restructuring process where they take a large haircut. So we have to find an alternative to do that. We still need these haircuts, but they have to come in a different form. The Jubilee has to come in a form of SDR donations from the rich countries, unused SDRs. Please notice these facts. 26% of rich countries' unused SDRs is enough to strike out 100% of the entire world's debts to the IMF and its trusts, RST and PRGT. That's a total only of 114 billion SDR, okay? Just 26% of their unused SDRs. Likewise, with 33% of the rich countries' unused SDRs is enough to strike out the entire IDA loan portfolio of the World Bank. And that's only 146 billion SDRs, okay? So this is the magnitude of what we could actually do just by giving an intelligent and creative use of the unused SDRs of the rich countries for a debt restructuring process with global implications that can give us an entire new perspective on what we can do, not only for climate purposes, but for poverty alleviation purposes, for hunger alleviation purposes, and to relaunch a relationship between global North and global South, right? And of course, some might say, oh, but if the rich countries donate their SDRs, then they're going to incur in a net negative position of SDRs. Sure, yeah, they can pay that net interest with the rest of their unused SDRs, or with official development assistance, or they can push, because they can, for a new issuance of SDRs and use those instead to pay for the interest payments derived from the donations. So solutions are here. This is a very a clear path to restore the situation, the financial situation of developing countries around the world for climate and other purposes, with assets that already exist that have no other use for now. Also, we've been discussing how the fact of the rising interest rates has caused a huge pressure on debt service for developing countries. And in this case, we can also use the rich countries' unused SDRs to subsidize the interest rate cap on variable rate MDB loans, such as the World Banks and the regional development banks. And that way we can, start to create some fiscal space in this environment. Now, I want you to keep this message in mind. It's that, sure, the SDRs have an initial and accounting regressive allocation, an initial allocation that is regressive. I think we can all agree on that because most of them go to the rich countries, but they have been very progressive in terms of use, very progressive in terms of use. And that means that we should spend less energy on trying to push for this rechanneling or for more debt in terms of SDRs, which is just euphemism because it's just debt that doesn't even have to be in SDRs, and spend less energy trying to modify this initial distribution that requires a modification of articles of agreement. And if we haven't even been able to change, the basic quotas, we're not even going to change this. It's been tried since the SDR's creation in 1969 with the famous development or aid link. There's been 60 years of failure for trying to change this formula. So what we need instead is a new issuance because we need to find actual concrete uses for the SDRs. This is a map showing us the allocation of SDRs in per capita terms. And as you can see, most of them in per capita terms went to the rich countries of the global north. But on the following map, you see the same thing, except not the allocation, but the uses. And as you can see, the uses have been concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in developing world. So this shows us clearly how the SDRs, even though they are regressive in terms of the initial allocation, they are very progressive in terms of how they are used. This is why we need more of them. Same basic principle here. I'm not going to go into these details. I only have a few minutes left, but the countries that have used them the most have been sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we are hoping and pushing for more countries to actually make use of them, both for balance of payments purposes and also for fiscal purposes. Same idea here. Sorry, I'm going to just skip through these. Now, if we really want to talk about rechanneling, I think we should focus on the IMF's own resources. This is from the IMF's latest financial report on January 31st. In the bottom right, you can see the total amount of usable, uncommitted resources that they have basically parked on their balance sheet without any use whatsoever, and what is happening with all that. We think, or I think, that this money, just like the World Bank also has unused usable currencies, they should be used as investments, right? And they should buy securities issued by the regional safety nets, the Latin American Reserve Fund, the Arab Monetary Fund, and different regional banks that support countries when they are in problems, such that there is more liquidity available in the regional hubs for the global safety net when you have all these unused resources. Also, please take into account that this means basically almost $300 billion in unused assets on the IMF's balance sheet, right? And only out of that, or in addition to that, they only have about $38 billion invested. Guess where? Mainly US corporate bonds and rich country sovereign bonds. So how can we talk about a change in the dynamics of the global financial system or their developing role if most of that is concentrated in rich countries' capital markets anyway? Now, very quickly, as I said, we need more SDRs and less capital flight. Here is a map showing us the concentration, the liquidity centralization of payments of the main correspondent banks to each country. This is a bit outdated as SWIFT hasn't published an updated map, but it clearly shows that in the case of Latin America, it's in the United States. In the case of Africa, it's also the United States, and some countries have French banks as the main correspondent banks. And what I want to show by this is that capital flight will tend to concentrate in the countries highlighted here. Just as Professor Ndikumana said yesterday, and that saves a lot of time for me, capital flight is the major issue that we have to fix, and I have some suggestions on how to do this. First, we have to identify who are the main players of this capital flight due to the centralization of payments. The main creators of international liquidity, because we forget that international liquidity is also endogenously created, but by hierarchically above and more powerful banks. In this case, these global banks, the ones that are members of the Wolfsburg Group, concentrate the cross-border payment space. So these have names that we have to focus on in terms of how international liquidity is being managed. And something that's very, very, very important, of course, since you saw Professor Ndikumana's presentation yesterday, it saves me a lot of explaining to do, but the IMF ignores the privatization of reserves that has been going on. This is just another name for saying capital flight, where we have illiquid states, but very, very, very liquid elites, or very, very liquid transnational corporations profiting from the developing countries. Just take into account these numbers from the international investment positions that have been published by the IMF themselves. In Argentina, the elite's foreign liquid assets are 53% of GDP, while the official reserves are 3.5% of GDP. In the case of Ukraine, the elite's foreign liquid assets, it's 88% of GDP. The official reserves only amount to 17% of GDP. How can we still analyze these countries' balance of payments, economy in general, without taking into account these facts? In the case of my country, Ecuador, elite's foreign liquid assets, it's 47% of GDP. And the official reserves are only up to 8% of GDP. In the case of Egypt, the relationship is similar. But look, in the case of Ghana, and I'm happy that we have colleagues from Ghana that will expose, they don't even publish the international investment position. And the IMF only resorts to saying, hey, we know there are large capital outflows, but we don't even have the statistics. But somehow that is not one of their main recommendations. Finally, and with this I conclude, there is a solution. When Keynes and White were drafting the articles of the agreement, they came up with this Article 8.2b, which used to be much more powerful in the sense of mandating that rich countries should repatriate the assets originated from capital flight to the developing back then European countries that were under reconstruction, where capital flight had fled from. And in this case, and you will see, it's Article 8, Section 2, letter B, that they say that capital that has flown away by basically evading the exchange control regulations should be unenforceable in the territories of any member. Basically, this means cooperate and try to bring those capital back to the countries where they originated from. We need a reverse FATCA. That's my conclusions. And thank you very much. You need more information, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andres.